Welcome, everybody. It's time once again for the next chapter with Charlie Hedges as he explores turning the page on his life and yours. Hey, Charlie.
Hey, Paul. You know, sometimes really good things occur totally unplanned, and today is one of those times. Truth is, only this morning I had a very last-minute cancellation with my guest. So as I was planning a solo-sode on the craft of creativity, I happened to receive a text early this morning from Courtney Marchesani about an unrelated issue, totally unrelated issue, and lo and behold, here she is with me to discuss creativity, as it happens to be one of her favorite topics. I am anxious to see how this show comes about. I trust serendipity. We will see how that flows. So let's welcome Courtney Marchesani. Courtney, what a serendipitous occasion to have you once again on the next chapter with Charlie, especially after our delightful show a couple weeks ago.
Oh, it was so fun, and I'm so glad that Serendipity has graced us again today. This is exciting. I love creativity. I know you said that in your intro, but it's one of my favorite topics. So I think it's going to be fun.
Good, and you know what's fun is that the way you view creativity, I have no idea if there is any integration in the way I view creativity. So this is going to be insightful for both of us as we bounce around and serve each other in our quest for a unique and meaningful life. As I was pondering the content for this show on the craft of creativity, I found myself so grateful for your willingness and kindness at the very last minute to join me today. That's very gracious of you, Courtney, at a very last minute. I know you had to change appointments. That's so kind.
It's easy and it's worth it because I think creativity is kind of a lost art. I mean, I think that we see it all around us still in advertising and movies and drama, but those things are changing so much towards commercialism. So when we're talking about true creativity, I would change anything to be able to tap into that because I think that's where the beauty, bubbles up is the human spirit. It is creative. There's a link. There's definitely a link between creativity and the human spirit.
It's funny you would use the word bubbles up. I think it occurs later. In my text, but too often I think we run the risk of putting creativity in the realm of the arts, and that is where creativity lives. When the truth is, every single one of us can explore and develop the craft of creativity, and that our lives can be creative. We may not be making film or art or, paintings or writings, but we are creating new opportunities for us and new ways of thinking if we only knew sort of, I hate to say techniques, but sort of some advantages and some sort of opportunities of how we can explore creativity. I'm so excited about exploring this subject. Now, Courtney, you are an expert at creativity. So before I give any of my ideas, I wonder, when I speak of this idea of creativity, what comes to mind for you?
I've hung out with a lot of really creative people that I would just say are way far out there in terms of their creative spirit and how they express it in the world. And so I've hung out with writers and actors and directors and painters. And I have to say that I've always kind of revered them for their ability to fluidly or so smoothly express themselves through their medium. But I agree with you, Charlie, that I think we all have the capacity. And I think that all you have to do to see evidence of that, the craft, is look at children, right? I mean, they're so open. They're so willing to draw what they see, and put that spirit down on paper or act it out for their parents. I mean, they're open. And so I think it's an openness with ourself. But in terms of creativity, there's also a devotion. So I think that there is a devotion to being creative that you cannot suppress when you're an artist. But I think everybody has the potential to tap into their own creativity, whatever that might be. I think we have a lot of hang-ups in our culture that separate us from that, because we think to ourselves, oh, I'm not an artist. And so that's like the first kind of stumbling block or thing that shuts us down. We don't think or relate ourselves to art necessarily.
Yeah, we have been given these negative signals that, first of all, that creativity is limited to the exceptional few. And secondly, we have been told, or at least it's been insinuated, that we are not creative. We are just, we are producers, and that's what we can do is we can produce, we can be rote, we can be journeymen and follow along this path. But the path of mastery, which I think is a path of creativity, is not proclaimed or not offered to so many people, and yet it truly needs to be. I like what you have to say about that, and especially with children. I want to think about openness. I believe that creativity does not exist without life's experience and life's research. You cannot sit in a room by yourself and say, I'm going to start painting, drawing, or writing. You must have information that guides you, that sparks you, that moves you. You read creative people. You read brilliant thinkers. And you take those thoughts, but you must begin with what you said with children. I think openness to new and speculative and even ideas that at first you may want to reject, but you have to ponder a while. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, well, and going back to the children thing, I mean, I have one friend whose parents were in New York and they were upwardly mobile, and they were very busy, and his grandmother was home with him, and he was in the basement like practicing Howdy Doody and doing voices and putting on different outfits, and the grandmother looked at him and said, this kid's an actor. And he was open, right? Had that willingness and that braveness and that courage to, take on, voices, forms, whatever he's experiencing. And so you do tend to see that openness, the inquisitiveness, the desire and that devotion I was talking about within the artist that starts in childhood and it just never kind of gets extinguished. But I think we're all capable of that openness, of taking on roles, of tapping into our deeper self and letting that language bubble up in different ways, whatever way it might be. I think that there is maybe a difference between talent, when you see people who are able to do that pure form of creativity, and that's called talent. And then, like you said, it's a mastery that evolves through practicing and shaping the art and honing it. But I do believe we all have access to it.
Yeah, I so agree. I'm thinking, as you're talking about, my son didn't have that sort of artistic, like playing characters. But you know what he would do is that he would spend behind a sofa, in between a sofa and a wall, and he would spend, Courtney, I'm going to guess 2 hours playing with dinosaurs. And he was in an entirely different world. He had no idea what was going on. He didn't hear what we were doing. There was no attention to it. He was in a world of his own. Is that not sort of a creative venue for him in that he's in a flow, he's in another world? And I think that helped him be sort of open to new ideas and new experiences and unafraid to sort of stretch his limits.
Oh, definitely. Anything you have access to. It could be dinosaurs. It can be, it can be shapes. It can be houses that you construct, forts that you can, construct in your backyard, or even just being in nature and talking to the trees is a form of creativity. So I think that there are a lot of what we would say judgments, or associations about creativity, but it can take so many different forms. I love that example of your son, because it can be anything, really. And time does seem to drop away. And that's the other thing about creativity, is when you get into that state, it is like time falls away. And you can just be in that mode, that creative mode, for hours and not recognize it just passes and you don't even know. That's one of the indicators for being in a truly creative state of mind. And your emotions, that's the other part, is the feeling. You get encompassed of that ecstatic feeling of whatever you're doing. And it's an energetic, like an inexhaustible source, creativity. That's kind of the way I like to describe it. It's an inexhaustible source that we can connect to, that flows through us. But what flows through us is not necessarily the product that we call creative or being creative. I like to look at it as that source flowing through us is creativity. That might make my opinion about it a little different from other people.
Oh, gee. Well, in my mind, we are simpatico in that, and you use a verb that I like a lot, and we refer to it in athletics, refer to it in writing and painting, and a very common verb is flow, is that we catch into, we get into the flow, and the flow consumes us and takes over, and that's what's happening very naturally in a child. But I think one of the things that can be damaging to creativity and flow is, I'd like to say, I hate to say it, but I don't hate to say it, and I think that's formal education. Formal education is so rote, so right and wrong answers, yes and no, check the right, A, B, C, multiple choice. And there's not an in-between. I was never good at multiple choice not because I said I don't believe in all of them, and I don't believe the right answer lies in all of them. I believe there is a right answer in every one of them, dependent upon the context. If you give me a context, I can show you why answer B is equally as good as answer A, and yet I'm not allowed to think that way. I have to think my choices are limited, and that is a destructive element to creativity and flow.
Oh, I don't hate to say it. I totally agree with you. I think the education system totally shuts down creativity. I mean, you can see its progression. There's less funding now for the arts and humanities than there ever has been before. I mean, I went to a liberal arts college and got my psychology degree, and I was really grateful for that. A lot of people kind of look down on the Bachelor's of Arts because it's less scientific, but I was exposed in my education to art appreciation, and social aspects of art and humanity and how important those things are in our art history. And so I was really grateful that I was able to get a degree that incorporated all those facets of art and appreciation of art, because it gave me a well-rounded education within the education system. But I recognize how rare that is now and looking back, and that's not the case. And so you might have amazing creativity, and it just gets completely shut down through the left brain, logical education paradigm. I totally agree.
Yeah,
I think we need to go back, and embrace, good art appreciation. So at least young people have exposure to the arts and they could recognize them in themselves. At least that would be a good start.
I think the arts are a prime example, but I'm always fearful of limiting it to the arts. I think one of the things we're talking about is in hemispheric brain thought, and that's from being able to access the right brain in a left brain culture, in a Newtonian paradigmatic culture of defining things strictly and precisely, rather than this in-between. You never know. There's curiosity. There's wonder, and there's a beautiful view of the wonder of life, of the beauty of life, of the integration of life, of the yin and the yang, of the animos and anima, that they are not separated. They are integrated, and when we get into the integration, then we have room for creativity. If we live purely Newtonian, there's not a lot of room for creative growth, because it has to be structured and proven, and many times creativity is not proven until somebody comes up with something very unique and unusual, and whether it's scientific, it's artistic, or it's just in the way that I live my life. I live my life not structurally, although I have structure. I'm not denying, the essential nature of structure, but there also needs to be a heartfelt, warm embracing of the wonder and the beauty of life.
Yeah, I love what you're saying about the right and left brain hemispheric synchronization. Because the more they start to study the left and right hemispheres in individuals who show more connections between the hemispheres, they show that they are highly creative. They are highly intuitive. It does seem to be, in a way, though, kind of a lost art, like what you're talking about. And before the call, we were talking about language and how creativity does show up through language and structures of thought. And so that's kind of where I go with the right and left hemispheric connectivity, because both hemispheres have language, right? But it's the way that the hemispheres perceive language. The right typically sees language in images and almost like a kaleidoscope of images coming into the right hemisphere. And then it's the left that puts words or semantic thought to the images to discern what is happening. Now, all of that's going through, right? All that's going through the optic nerve into the visual cortex to make sense of what these pictures are in the human experience. But the synchronization of both the left and right and having that really high level of connectivity between right and left is really it's a profound feeling, right? And perception together. It's perception and feeling together. And then when you add language into that, it's like this magical linguistic fireball for the individual because it's just flowing through them. And the left and right hemisphere seem to be integrated in a way that they have more creativity. I mean, that's been shown in studies.
I love that. And you know what seems to me, we have a temptation to define and to narrow. And there is both in left and right hemispheric brain thought a tendency to want to define what that image is, define what that knowledge is. And sometimes it's better to say, in my opinion, it's better to say, that's really interesting information, but I have no idea how to apply it and what it means today. I just have to wait. You know, I'm strongly into waiting. I'm calling it. I'm writing a lot these days on the slow work of God, and that the slow work of nature in our life. That we don't come up with answers automatically. It takes time of pondering and waiting and seeing. And sometimes it's days, months, and decades, and sometimes it's years. I was on a journey that started a couple of years ago, and it's beginning to gain some clarity, although I'm not there. But the clarity, I could never have come up with it without going on this journey. Had I sought to identify it and to close it off, I would have lost the beauty of the learning, of the creative learning of what I have experienced, because I too quickly identified it. I wish I had this quote, this beautiful quote from a book that it's blown my mind. It's called Speculative Fiction. It's a new form of science fiction. I don't know if it's new, but it's new to me. And the book is titled, This Is How You Lose the Time War, by Amal El Mohtar and Max Gladstone. In one of the letters, there's two female heroines in this movie, that one says, I want to speak of the thoughts that you just, speak of the letter that you just wrote me, but if I were to speak of the letter, I would contain what it did to me, and that would make it small. I loved that. I underlined that. And there's only two underlines in the whole book, or two highlights in the whole book, and that is one of them. And that when we contain a thought, we make it small, we limit it, and we do not allow for its growth, and therefore we do not allow for creativity.
Well, and I think what you're talking about, the slow forms, the slow process, is in such contrast with what we're experiencing now. I I mean, there was a time where things were slower at a slower pace. I mean, I grew up on a farm, so I can relate, to what you're talking about, that slower pace. I mean, we all had chores, we all had things to do. It's not like we weren't busy doing stuff, but it seemed like it was a slower pace. And I feel like that is in direct contrast to now, where everything's on demand. I mean, there is even, access to movies on demand. So it's like this new technological society is in direct contrast of like slow thought, slow movement, slow journeys, innerscapes, inner discoveries. It's all seems to be mass marketed, mass produced. How can we be more competitive, especially with creativity? I mean, creativity is not lost in these environments where it's totally commercialism and production, and it's there, but it's such demand and being driven. Here's an example. I was talking with a young woman recently, very creative herself. She's a writer. She's in her mid-20s. She's produced a couple scripts already, but, they weren't able to be produced. She took them to Netflix and a couple other places. But she and I were talking, and she told me about this dream that she had. So I think this relates to, what you're talking about, Charlie, with the inner creativity. So she tells me about a dream that she has where there's like these Nordic gods, these epic Nordic gods. She sees them, she sees their brands, right? They're like Celtic type of brands on their weaponry. And there's this huge mythic dream about the dragon of time, is what she called it. And so she had to solve this whole epic battle between these Nordic gods by going back to the dragon of time, tricking it, doing some kind of answer that only she had within her. This is all in the dream. And then she figured it all out. And she came out of the dream. She wrote it all down. She told me about it. And she's like, what am I supposed to do with that? And so my answer was, you have to wait. You're not exactly sure, but this is an archetypal dream. It's a mythic battle. There is the dragon of time. What does that mean to you? And this is a slow process. But this is an exact example of an artist or that creativity bubbling up within an individual, and they don't necessarily understand the meaning of it yet, even though during the dream, it was very clear to her that it was important. She was involved in the battle, and she had an answer. And so I love what you're talking about. And creativity is obviously still alive, because the young people of our culture are having these type of epic archetypal dreams in their own experience. But do we know what they mean yet? No. It takes time to unravel it through your own journey, through your own life experience. And you wait and see what comes next.
We call it instant gratification, but it's not. It's more than that. It's instant application. And wisdom does not come instantly. Wisdom is a very long time oriented. I've said it's unfortunate that wisdom is reserved for the old, that you could not get this wisdom. I could not have this wisdom 30 years ago. I would have lived my life much differently. And that I am learning the value of waiting. And I think that is so wise of you. I think that is so true, that shows what a brilliant coach and advisor and consultant and friend you would be, in that you can tell somebody, don't try to come up with the answer to this. Just sit on it, ponder it, watch it, see what happens, see how it materializes, and know it's not just going to be days. I'm sorry, but it may be months and even years. But the beauty of it will show. It will come out, as long as that's even. It doesn't even have to be front of mind. It can be back of mind. But it's on the back burner, but it's still there, and then something will come and it will bring it back up to the front burner. I love the waiting.
Well, and the synchronicity is part of it too. I do think that these things are not on the forefront of our mind unless we've gone through something pretty dramatic and we're trying to tap in to creative solutions, and we're asking ourselves deeply, what is the next step? I do believe then the creative force comes closer into your attention and right in front of you. But I do think a lot of times it bubbles up, or I like to describe it as butterflies. It feels like butterflies that kind of float around And I was explaining to you before, one of my ways of describing the creativity, it's a vibration. It's a language. It's hard to express it in a definition, but what you know it when you see it. Like if it's one person's time dragon, it's another person's, rainbow that they see that kicks off a melody, or the vibration that you feel, or the people that you're drawn to, and the conversations that you have. Creativity just seems to flow and ebb and flow in the movement of life and the living of life.
That is so beautifully well said. You know what I'd like to do? When I take a break, I would like to do exactly the opposite of what I've said here. I would like to give people not steps, but just ideas, just thoughts about how they might incorporate this time, the use of time, the use of different aspects. I told you I have this concept that have come to my mind of a weaver and a thief. I would like to wind that into our next half and get your feedback and input on that. So let's take a quick break, and we'll come back to some of my crazy ideas. Hi there, this is Charlie Hedges, and you're listening to The Next Chapter with Charlie and my oh-so-special guest, Courtney Marchesani, who is a spiritualist. She talks about divine spiritual activity in your life, and she is a creative, hungry for creativity in life, and she has so many wonderful views, and as we've seen in the first half. Now, we're going to take the second half, and creativity has been part of my thinking in the last few days, and I want to bring up some of my ideas, and I want to get Courtney's feedback, support, or if she disagrees, I'm very open to that. So let's begin with this. For me, I don't know that I see creativity as this one-time insight, divinely inspired revelation. I see it as something that is nurtured and developed over time. I don't see the divine, the muse necessarily coming in and giving me a whole brand new idea that I have not been nurturing. So I am inclined to understand creativity as a developed craft, as opposed to some kind of divine or otherworldly revelation. Now, I most certainly believe in divine revelation, but only with the diligent work of what I like to see as feeding the divine seed. I believe our creative insights are the result of what we nurture. So I have two metaphors, and then I want your feedback, Courtney. One metaphor is I believe in the muse, but I believe the muse is a sister, a hungry sister that requires feeding. I need to read, I need to study, I need to be open-minded, I need to be information gathering, and I'm taking time to ponder all these new metaphors, all these new inputs, and the muse will use all of these inputs and then integrate them with my thoughts. Because if I'm not doing that, I'm not giving the muse anything to work with. I'm giving the muse, all of a sudden, give me this brand new idea I've never thought before. Well, the muse doesn't seem to respond that way in my life, maybe in some lives. That's one metaphor. The second metaphor is I also see creativity as a seed that is planted in fertile and tilled soil, fed and nurtured with diligent care, and then will grow to a plant that we can use. So there is this collaborative effort between me and creativity in that I am feeding it, I am open-minded, and at the same time know that I'm going to get clarity many times outside my own mental framework. How do you respond to that?
Well, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I don't know that if we're going to call it a divine seed, that's being planted, I look at that more as being rooted and very grounded in reality, metaphorically, and that we nurture it with water and food and the growth cycle. And so I don't necessarily, to me, that's kind of a uniform process, whereas I feel like with the muses and the divine spark and the sisters, the lights, the lamps of illumination that are within us that artists usually talk about, where they go in those moments that seems kind of mystical and exclusive to them. I'm not sure those two ideas are mutually exclusive. So I wanted to just ask you that before I go into what I feel are maybe the differences. Are you saying they are mutually exclusive, or are you saying they overlap?
I say absolutely they overlap.
The muses. Okay.
Yeah, they overlap. Okay. They're just two different metaphors. We have windows of thought. We have layers of thought, windows of thought, and these are just two different layers of thought, but both are, in my mind, both are extant.
Yeah, and I think they're processes, okay? So I think that there are processes that we use. Sometimes I feel creativity drives the process. I don't necessarily know that we feel that we're using a process, but I think that the way creativity hits us, sometimes it feels out of the blue or like a thunderbolt. And it does feel divine in the way that it occurs. But then there's the trickling, right? The eddying. It seems like, it's more fluid, that we're feeding creativity, and it kind of pulls up in a way, and it does feel fluid. And I do think that also falls under another kind of a process where we're providing structure for it. And so I can describe in my own process and my devotion to writing as one of the mediums that I feel truly creative in, where I can just let the creative welling up flow through me, and I'm kind of a conduit for it, but it feels like it's coming from somewhere else. I know that somewhere else is my own divinity, but it still feels like what we've described, blissful, all-encompassing, that I'm just kind of allowing it to come through me, but it is that inexhaustible source or flow. Whereas creativity for me, when I put a lot of structure on it, kind of like in relation to the educational process, I feel that it's more something that I have to feed routinely to get that consistency. It's still there, but it feels like a smaller voice rather than that big welling up or that big river coming through. And I know those are a lot of metaphors, but that's the way that I conceive of it for myself, because I do think creativity is a hard thing to describe. But when I've talked with other people who have experienced that same thunderous kind of force moving through them, they describe it similarly. They use different words, but it does feel like being connected to something larger and allowing it to flow through you, which can be very overwhelming and scary a little bit, because it does feel like you're almost kind of harnessing Mother Nature for a brief period of time and allowing it to flow through you. That's the best way that I can use to describe it. But I wouldn't describe them at that eddying, like a river eddying up or a stream eddying up, or the planting of a seed. I don't necessarily think that they're separate. I think that they're very similar, actually.
Yeah, they really are, and I probably misrepresented the feeding. I don't mean it to be rote. I mean it to be, I'm helping give myself new ideas that are just kind of hanging back there, that for me, the muse will apply. I'm giving my mind other things to think about, because I believe creativity is so much in the imagination, and that unless I expand my imagination, I will be limited in what I can do. But I so agree with you. I'm thinking of my, what I call right now that I'm writing in the mornings, I'm writing morning musings. And if you could read my last two morning musings, and if you've read my blogs, it sounds like two different writers. One is I'm, writing to an audience and writing blah, blah, blah. Here's what I think about X and such. And my musings are totally in the flow. And it sounds like another writer. They are so otherworldly, and they are so right now, right today. They're not always this way. But after reading this novella, it has got me to thinking, and it is the muse that is taking me in a whole different realm of thought. But it was inspired by a book. It was inspired by the very, very, very extraordinarily creative revelations of another book that got me thinking in a whole new dimension. And it's a dimension of time, dimension of space, and all based on the value and the primacy of love. And I'm just the language I use, Courtney, you would laugh. You would not think this is the same author by any means. But the second writings in the flow are a whole different sort of literary, mystical, very different sort of tone, because the audience is me only. I don't care about what anybody else thinks.
Well, I love where you started going with that, like time, space, and love. That's a great title. I was thinking that as you were saying that, it was like, ooh, time, space, and love. And then, the play off other books like Love in the Time of Cholera. And, there's something there. There's something there about the primacy of love and time in space that you're working on that I feel is really important just intuitively. But when you were starting to talk about the two different people or the different ideas coming through you, and it seems like different people, the one who sprang to mind, the artistic luminary that sprang to mind immediately was like William Blake. William Blake was a visionary, and he had a steadfast faith in the human spirit as kind of a related theme to what we're talking about. And he actually saw in his visual field, what at the time and during his time they called specters. So they were goddesses. They were, sometimes otherworldly spirits. And so he depicted through his artwork and his visual perception this battle that he felt that was going on. Now, maybe some people go back and look at him and say, well, it was a battle between himself and the orthodoxy of the church at the time that he was depicting. But he actually was described as seeing images that appeared real to him that he painted. And so when you start to talk about perception or language or the way it comes through, there's different phenomenon that appear in creativity that cannot be described. They can't be explained. And psychic automatism is one of them. And William Blake was actually identified, his artwork, as being psychic automatism, which is kind of a little bit...
Would you describe that, please?
Psychic automatism is when the artist or the person who's experiencing this inexhaustible force or source coming through them as creative force, right? The creative force is moving through them. The person who is experiencing it describes themselves as kind of stepping outside of themselves or moving one step to the left or to the right and letting the force flow through them. And they don't always necessarily take credit for the creative work that is being done. And so psychic automatism is when they feel like they're more of a channel and less of the actual artist producing it under their own conscious control. That's the best way to describe it. But what you're describing is similar. You're talking about feeling this creativity moving through you, and you're looking at the different ways that you're creating, and it seems very different. The voices seem very different. So I don't say that you are experiencing psychic automatism because you're still under your own control and your own, will creating it, but it sounds close, doesn't it?
Oh, it's when I am creating it, I am not in my own will. My whole time-space continuum is so upside down right now in that I'm thinking of layers of time. I'm thinking of that we live in this one cosmos, this eternal cosmos, and I'm thinking I'm entertaining the thoughts, why can't there be others? Why does there have to be only one eternity? If we have a God capable of everything, then there certainly could be multiple eternities. I know it sounds crazy, but we're limited to time. We're limited to time and space, so we can only think in one eternity. But are there others? And that's where my thoughts are going. And
that's Spinoza. Spinoza talked about the three layers. And he talked about eternal recurrence, and he talked about some similar ideas. So I don't think that is crazy. I think actually some really profound philosophers have explored things like eternal recurrence. And Spinoza is one of the people I look to because he was a profound thinker. But it sounds like you're explaining, with your layers of time and love and space and devotion. These things they go beyond words. They tap into something more. And just quickly before I go and phase into another topic, the other person who I was thinking about when we were talking about, the specters that kind of appeared to William Blake and then how he transformed them, the images that became alive for him during his creative art, was the other one I was thinking about was Alma Drawings. Alma Drawings grew up in a very remote area in Ontario, Canada. And, she had some artistic ability or some creative ability, but it wasn't like she practiced any kind of medium all the time. And when she got older, she was I think this would really interest you, Charlie. You should check her out. There's a documentary about her called the Alma Drawings. And, she was likened to William Blake because she was in her at least middle age. I think it might have been 45 when she started to have these spontaneous, creative moods, I guess is the best way to describe it, where she once again had these like visionary experiences that were coming to her, but she didn't take credit for it. But she did all these drawings that flew through her. And so her work was also determined to be psychic automatism, that she was essentially allowing through her creative force, and a marriage of her creative force and however else she described it, which was basically like she said, this isn't mine, it's coming from somewhere else. But the motifs that were depicted were like ancient tribal art, Buddhist art. I mean, Rinpoche looked at them, Dalai Lama's advisor, and said, these are tribal art that are very similar of our form of medium of tapestry. And so then he would go in and identify the actual identities that she drew. Now, she only knew the Bible. She didn't do any kind of cross-cultural comparative study of other religions. But it's the similar kind of thing where you see this time, space dissolve, right, with the creative process, and something comes through. It's coming through in its own language, depending on the medium or the person who is relaying it.
Oh my goodness! You just described me because in this novel that I've read, in this speculative fiction, this is not a Christian book. There is nothing mentioned of God in it. But as I completed the book, it was the best portrayal of the eternal love of God that I've ever read, that is so consistent with Scripture. And it's like my vision of Scripture that was created by somebody who's not of the discipline at all. And yet I want to write the authors and tell them, close with this idea. And I just wonder, we don't have to talk long on it because I know we've gone a bit. It's just something that occurred to me this morning. And since it's in the title of the podcast, although I can change the title before we publish, but I'm calling it A Weaver and a Thief. And I believe as a creative, my creative self is that of a weaver and a thief, is that I steal threads of brilliance from others and weave those threads into a tapestry of my own making.
I love it. I mean, I'm such a visual person. So I see like this man, like this image of this man, but it's almost like cartoonish, almost with a light, like a torch that he's running and he's got the thread, but he's also running with the light at the same time. And so that immediately like evoked an image for me of the thief, but also the weaver. And so I'm not a drawer, like I don't draw, but it's a really cool image that came to mind when you said your phrase of where you're at right now with the creation aspect of your persona.
I think somewhere in there has to be this wholly other inspiration of the divine muse that is different than the thief. That not all ideas are stolen. Some ideas are given, that are offered, that come in a language we talk about in our last podcast, that come from a whole nother source, that come from somewhere other than the sort of logical or intuitive mind.
I think it is an intuitive process. I mean, I've been like reluctant to say it because I don't want to be cliche, but a lot of researchers link creativity and intuition, and they call it creative intuition. I mean, it's been studied in corporations and corporate movements on how to tap into this thought process, because intuition is essentially this shortcut where you get this sudden arrival of comprehension. Now, that's legal or corporate speak for inventiveness, but when you put it into the realm of creativity, this is the language of the creatives. They don't need those labels. It comes to them in moments of inspiration. I mean, it is literally in spirit. Being embodied in spirit in those moments it's completely intuitive process, and it is a lost language. It is a lost art. But I love a weaver and a thief. It evokes so much, and it's very curious. It really gets you curious about what's going to happen next. And I like the idea of not going to that. It's kind of shameful, in the artistry world that we steal things from other people, but all artists are stealing from everybody else all the time. We are. It's known. Stop making it be blasphemous, I mean, it's borrowing, really. It's borrowing, right? Can I borrow this from you? And a lot of times artists who are of that code will say, hey, can I borrow that? And the other person will say, yeah, because it's a compliment. It's a recognition of the creative spirit in the other individual, and that it's caught on. And somebody's like, yeah, cool, man. That's cool. I want to use it. Can I? So maybe we ask permission, or maybe we don't, but it's known. That is a known phenomenon in subculture.
In history, we've only gotten into, since, post the Age of Reason and all of that, where we're quoting people. The old philosophers never quoted anybody else. They would say something, but they didn't say, oh, Epicurus said this. They would just say it as if it's truth. It's accepted. I
just realized that Herodotus ripped off Pindar. Okay, like I was researching Herodotus and how he said culture is king, and how culture really is what shapes our thoughts and emotions, right? And then I went and did all this research on him, and it was Pindar, and he said custom is king. Custom is king, and he was talking about, the gods or God or whatever, pantheism, wherever he was coming from. And so I thought, okay, Shakespeare used it. Shakespeare uses it later, right? The custom is king. And so you can see it gets passed down all the way back to Pindar, right? And so Herodotus was no great shakes. He was just ripping off Pindar.
Yeah, well, or maybe not so much ripping off, but expanding.
Yes, and he was expanding. He was certainly expanding in his own way. And he goes into it. Herodotus goes into, different belief systems of different cultures and how we shouldn't close ourselves off and we should be open even though we don't agree. I mean, there's a lot of really good stuff in Herodotus. So I don't mean to shame him, but yeah, he took from Pindar.
Courtney Marchesani. And listeners, please know that this was a genuine conversation. There were not a whole lot of questions, but there was genuine conversations, and I knew it would be brilliant with Courtney because she is always on top of her game and always thinking. Any way you want us to get in touch with you, Courtney?
Oh, everybody knows on your podcast I'm on Inspire Potentials.
Okay.
That's how you find me, Inspire Potentials, because it's hard to say my name. So just type those two phrases in and I'm on the top.
Okay. Thank you so much, my friend.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. It was very stimulating.
Yes, hang on for just a sec. I also want to thank our listeners for tuning in to the next chapter with Charlie. And if you get a chance, check out our website. And until next, this is Charlie Hedges signing off. Bye for now.